everyone, and welcome to Mass Culture's second digital gathering about cultural development in rural and remote areas. My name is Bridget MacIntosh, and I'll be your facilitator today. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank the Ontario Trillium Foundation for hosting us today, and to the Mass Culture staff for putting this event together. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement to start our event off. We recognize that our work today, taking place at the Ontario Trillium Foundation's head office, is located on a traditional Indigenous territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Toronto, and in every city, town, and community in which each of you reside, is still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet and work on this territory. We also acknowledge that the reach of our work today extends beyond to other traditional Indigenous territories. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth for the resources we are using and honor all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on the land since time immemorial. And moving on, let me tinker with my PowerPoint there about mass culture. So mass culture began in 2018 and is focused on the discussion of a model that will support accurate and holistic data. We want to be able to have this mass culture be an opportunity to examine cultural policy in Canada and figure out what type of data is needed and how we can connect and collaborate across Canada. The mass culture digital gatherings are an evolution in how we can gather this relevant data about cultural policy. This is our second digital gathering, and we really wanted to have a panel that was not so much about us talking to you, but rather engaging with you. And it is a pilot, it's an experiment. And each time we go through the gathering, we are looking at ways to make it, take the format a bit better and more engaging, to make sure that we are tapping into all the great expertise and knowledge that all of you, our attendees, bring to the table. So right now, I do have Felicity and Annalie, who will be our conversations, and we will be sharing their insights to start the discussion. But again, we are looking to you for your insights to share. So there is a chat box that you can engage with. So do feel free to share any insights, questions, comments. They are being monitored, so please make sure to take advantage of that. The conversation today is also being live tweeted using the hashtag MCDigital, so do feel free to engage on that front. And we will be sharing all of this information on the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Knowledge Center. So because all of us in the cultural planning field rely on benchmarking, beyond just this Match Culture digital gathering, there is a ton of resources available on the Knowledge Center. So we encourage you to go to that site afterwards. And I believe the link is posted there by Liz. Feel free to register and look at the resources that are there. I also want to acknowledge that we have a lot of attendees that are joining us from across Canada on this. And cultural policy is such a vast topic. And of course, we won't be able to get to all of the questions today. So again, do make use of all of the interactive resources that are available so that we can capture the knowledge. This is also important because it will help us develop future digital gatherings to get into more detailed topics and to really get the data and the information that we all need to make the cases for our reports and other programs that we're all working and leading on. So moving on to our guests today, I'm joined by Felicity Bacquel of Conseil des Arts Masculine Arts Council and SPARC, the Supporting Performing Arts in Rural and Remote Communities, and Annalie Adair, who is a cultural consultant from A. Adair and Associates, who is also leading the cultural plan for the town of Canmore. More information about both Annalie and Felicity can be found on the Mass Culture and the OTF website. Again, I mentioned earlier that cultural policy is a huge topic, and there are many things that we can get into, especially even looking at rural and remote communities. We wanted to focus in today, though, on two questions. And I know earlier, Fanny Martin from Mass Culture emailed out questions to all of the attendees about some areas that we are focusing on. And so I'll be looking at those questions in conversation with Felicity and Annalie today. And those questions are, what is truly unique about developing cultural plans and initiatives outside of large cities? What is the place and role of art? And what challenges and opportunities are found in that rural and remote environment? And what support and resources do artists and cultural workers need in rural and remote areas? And again, I'm just going to leave this up here, a little bit more about Felicity and Annalie and some of our questions. And as we go through the conversation, both Felicity and Annalie have provided some visuals about some of the work in their own communities. So as the conversation goes on, I'll be progressing the slides through that. And we encourage all of the attendees, if you have images, case studies, stories you want to share from your communities, do feel free to share them. We want to be able to celebrate them, share them, and hopefully have them be case studies that other people can learn from. So I will start the conversation with you, Felicity. Hello, how are you?
How are you? Hi.
Great. So I just need to go through my notes here and make sure I'm on the right page. So yeah, sorry, Felicity. So based on your work in Temiskaming and in collaboration with MDB Insights, I know you worked with them on a regional cultural sustainability plan. What do you think makes working in the rural and remote cultural development field unique?
Thank you, Bridget. Hello to everybody. And I just wanted to say a quick thank you to Bridget and Fanny for inviting me here to chat with everyone. So I was watching the first digital gathering last month, and although I enjoyed it, I found there was so much to it. It was difficult to relate living in a small city. I'm in Temiskaming Shores. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. We can hear you. All good, yeah.
No, just my screen.
Of course, no worries, yeah.
Yeah, so I live in Temiskaming Shores, which I would also like to acknowledge is on the traditional territories of the Algonquin peoples of the Temiskaming First Nations. We have a population of about 10,000 people, and we amalgamated about 3 small towns amalgamated about 15 years ago. Northeast Ontario, we're about 5.5 hours drive straight north from Toronto. In any case, while I was engaged in that digital gathering last month, the most striking difference between cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Edmonton that really jumped out at me watching Patrick Branislav and Sanjay talk about their work is that not only do we not have a department or division of culture in our municipality, we actually have no municipal staff at all responsible for cultural development. I think this may be true of many small cities in Ontario, although I would love to hear what other people's situations are in their small towns. But we are lucky to have an economic development officer who believes in cultural development. And around 2010, when the Creative Communities Prosperity Fund provincial funding was available to do municipal cultural plans, he applied for that, and we did a municipal cultural plan. And we followed that up with a regional cultural sustainability plan, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So we ended up with 2 really fantastic cultural development plans, but this work really was beyond the mandate of the economic development officer, and then so we had no way to implement these plans. So right now our Arts Council is being tasked with implementing the plans, which brings with it a number of challenges, including the fact that it sort of feeds into the misconception that the cultural plan is an arts plan, which it really isn't. And also we're trying to survive on a budget of less than $5,000 a year. So it's a difficult task we've been asked to do. The second major difference I find between cities and rural and remote communities is the hugely different challenges we face, as well as the different strengths we have to draw upon. Some of the what I think are common challenges in rural and remote communities, but again, I would love to hear if other people can relate to these. Things like population retention and aging, and population attraction, youth engagement, and youth out-migration. Loss of traditional economic resources and industries, and as well as we tend to have a huge dependence on volunteerism, which comes with its own challenges like volunteer aging and retention, as well as the reality that volunteers are often asked to accomplish tasks that may be beyond their skill level. Which again has its problems because we don't tend to have a lot of opportunities for skills development, which also is difficult for artists and cultural workers in general. But we do have in rural, remote communities a lot of valuable strengths to draw upon, like incredible natural beauty, and we have walking and biking trails, fascinating histories, great community spirit, all of these things which contribute to a unique sense of place, which is key to the quality of life to not only us as community members, but also can be a huge draw for new residents and for tourists. So that's kind of my summary there of the differences.
No, that's fantastic. And it's interesting, you mentioned at one point, both the funding and also like the skill sets, and that there really isn't any money or certain departments that exist in smaller municipalities to be able to support this type of work. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier that some questions were sent out to our attendees. We got some great responses, so I'm going to just highlight Terry Suter, the manager of Arts and Culture in Huntsville, and Tasia Piptruck from Riverfront Inner Arts in Windsor. They both identified, and if you're on this call, hello guys, thank you so much for your responses. Terry specifically mentioned the disappearance of the Ontario Creative Community Prosperity Fund, which was an opportunity for smaller municipalities to be able to access funds, to work with consultants and skilled staff to be able to develop culture plans in smaller municipalities and be able to move that work forward. And so with that in mind, I'm going to switch over to Annalee for a moment. And Annalee, you've worked in both large and smaller municipalities across the country. And twofold question, I also want to hear your thoughts on what you think makes rural and remote cultural planning unique. And also, have you, through your work, encountered any strategies to combat the lack of funding or that lack of a cultural division or municipal infrastructure to support cultural development in smaller municipalities?
Okay.
It's a mouthful.
Hi, everyone. Yeah. Thank you for the invitation to share learnings among each other. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, a lot of it, you know, Liz or Felicity has talked about in terms of the high dependence on volunteers. And also, I mean, that's quite common. The tie to the land and the human response to place and the associations that people carry with them in terms of memories are strongly rooted attachment pieces. So I do find that. I also find, I have found both living and working in smaller communities, that the personal and professional relationships overlap a lot. It's kind of one of these, everyone knows everyone, and the same people wear many hats in the community. So while you might have culture staff in the municipality, there are many people that do a multitude of things within the community, and there usually is a core group of people that are both working at the food bank and on performances and volunteering, you know, in many different ways. I also find that because cultural development isn't that old in Canada, that the founders of the cultural sector development are a lot aging, for one, and still very active in communities. So, and with this kind of personal and professional relationship crossover, there tends to be a commitment to the work and a commitment to the community that has a strong sense of duty and obligation, whether that's through volunteerism or whether it's through staff at arts organizations or arts councils or municipalities. So those are some of the, and also there's usually only one space that can be used for cultural activity, which is also a big thing. Usually it's a shared space, like a school stage or a gym. There may be one dedicated space, but no capacity to serve the population, right? So there's a multitude of challenges. But I think one of the key pieces is that the language, and then the language that we use around the work that we're trying to get supported is not understood. Cultural development is just not a word that works within the municipality even, and as Felicity said, the staff are under another department, or this obligation or commitment to culture usually comes out of planning or recreation or economic development. So I think the understanding of the terms that we use and the language that we use, and if there is an understanding, it's a very narrow understanding of what it entails. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of events that seem cultural in nature. So those are there's a higher dependency on each other and volunteers. So that's that's a start.
Oh, absolutely. And I know we're just looking at one of the comments that have come in, and I know we're trying to make sure it's shared with everybody. And it was from Sandy Crawley. He has a great suggestion. If there are no bureaucrats assigned, the first step is to identify a political champion at whatever level of government is accessible. The challenge never really lessens. Even when you have resources, the results of the reward, as with arts practice itself. And I think that touches right back to your point, Annalee, about when you're in a small community, there really is that professional, personal overlap. And I think finding those political leaders in those smaller communities as well and building those relationships, sharing the knowledge is a great first step. So Sandy, thank you for sharing that on the chat. And also, Annalie, while I have you here, we also have another comment from Karen Bell. Hello, Karen. I hope you are joining us today. She's a consultant who's based in Calgary, and she was very interested in your experience, Annalie, with cultural planning in communities that have seasonal residents or that are more, I guess, well, she's referenced tourism driven. So specifically about balancing the need for culture as a driver of tourism and economic diversification with the ability to serve full-time residents with authentic, locally focused cultural engagement opportunities. I wonder if you have any thoughts or response to that you can share with us.
Yeah, it's that's a pretty complex question, because cultural tourism is a whole thing in itself. In doing some thinking about it and even some research, I will add a resource to your library. That there's a paper on cultural development, cultural tourism, changing times. There's some case studies in there that you might find helpful, Karen, for this. So I will add that in there. I think we are currently looking at this in Canmore, obviously, because of the community itself. But I think where we're going with it in terms of that is that the community needs to pursue development for local needs and priorities have to be considered before the development of tourist needs. So that tourism should be managed as a local resource where local needs and priorities take precedent over the goals of the tourism industry. So in terms of, in that piece, that the quality of life in the community is taken as a starting point, and tourism is we're trying to look at this through the lens that if the quality of life in community is taken seriously, and we are looking at that in terms of the community needs and priorities, then tourism is one of the instruments to improve it, potentially, because it is a continuum, and it's not like an either or. And I guess evaluating the state of readiness what stage has the community reached where the development process has satisfied those community needs as a place to live, and how can it then offer the community as a place to visit to the wider community of tourists. So I think this whole relationship between place to live and place to visit is, to me, is a good starting point in terms of empowering that, and based on community values. So that doesn't always get into the conversation when we're talking about cultural tourism. So, because usually it's seen as an approach to development, and some of the intangible factors of the community sense of pride and place are narrowed down to specific sites that have tourist type interest. So that's the start of the conversation. I'd like some input from people, and I can go on, but I don't want to be.
Oh, no worries at all.
Yeah.
And I think so. Thank you for that, Annalie. And just going back again to other opportunities that cultural workers can do in rural and remote communities, I'm going to refer to another response that we got from Marie-Claire Finley-Brook, who is joining us from the Yukon, the Klondike Institute of Arts and Culture. So thank you, Marie-Claire, for joining us. And she references that some synergies or some opportunities can be found in engaging with the health and social sector. In her particular community, remote communities are heavily impacted by mental and physical health challenges, and engagement with art and culture can be seen as a way to support good health and well-being. So again, as another resource, not only going to political champions, other sectors, and really quick, and Felicity, I don't know if you have any insights that you want to share on this. I know you wear many hats in your work, and have you found any other synergies or collaborations, again, to help champion cultural development in rural remote regions? Any thoughts that you want to share on that?
Nothing else in particular, just regarding the health issue, though. I was asked last week to sit in on a strategic planning session with our public health unit, and they're reaching out to us, realizing how important it is for them, arts and culture and quality of life, and the idea of social prescribing and things like that. So yeah, absolutely, it's about partnering and reaching out and finding the right people to connect with in the schools and everywhere, for sure. Yeah.
Definitely. We have another comment that says about maybe we need to take a critical look at tourism culture whenever we talk about cultural tourism. And I think we did have some comments back from the attendees who had referenced that part of the challenge with cultural planning or cultural development in rural and remote communities is that it is sometimes used primarily as a economic development PR tool, as opposed to that quality of life, social well-being factor. And I just got a note saying that it's hard to hear me, so I will tinker with that. So apologies to everyone who can't hear me. But going back to the cultural tourism point or what have you, any strategies that we can look at to combat that? And I know we got some responses about partnering regionally or remote communities working together with the region or what have you to look at culture plans or strategies that really look at maintaining the uniqueness of a community as opposed to just tourism or PR. And again, Annalie, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that you want to share, like perhaps like a strategy for partnering on a regional level. Any experiences with that?
I don't professionally have experience with that. I do know that that the participation of arts and cultural organizations in tourism strategies and so on is critical because it tends to be business focused. As opposed to community focused. So that kind of community empowerment and setting those values from the beginning is particularly important. We're about to go into conversations with the business and tourism sectors in Canmore. We're in the very early stages. So I'm certainly willing to sort of submit anything that, to the library that we can in that regard. But that's just one place. But I do know that this is a huge dynamic that goes on between, maintaining the uniqueness of community and at the same time being progressive, and usually it's private sector development that is forging this progression. So the concept of partnering may not be as possible, but the concept of opening conversations around having the uniqueness, and because once a community becomes so developed that its authenticity and uniqueness starts to fade right into tourism, like there's a continuum, and at some point it doesn't remain as primitive anymore, and so on. So the tourist attraction may die. So there's a whole thing around colonialism and indigenous, indigenous cultures that are taken into account when we're talking about this, that I don't think I'm as qualified to touch on, but I do think that has to be certainly part of the conversation. So I'd be interested in hearing from others what they think about that in terms of the tourism industry and the whole concept of ethnic tourism and cultural tourism.
Excellent. Okay, and I know while we wait for some feedback on that topic, Annalie, I'll move over to our second question just to start exploring that topic, and then we can always jump back. And I'm just going to do another sound check. I know we were getting some notes saying that there were still some concerns with my sound. So I'm just doing a check to see how the volume is, and we'll just keep monitoring that. So moving on to the second question, and this was about what support and resources do artists and cultural workers need in rural and remote areas. And so I'll shift back over to you, Felicity. As a practicing artist and cultural worker in the rural region, and based on your work with Spark, what resources or supports do you feel are most needed for artists and cultural workers to support their livelihoods?
Thank you. I would say, at least in our community and that I know of, there really are very few individuals who are able to work full-time as artists or cultural workers because there just aren't the jobs available. Our organizations run for the most part on either part-time staff or volunteers. And I can't even think of 5 people that I know who sustain a living solely through their work as artists. I also think it's a little easier if you're living in a city to find a part-time job like waiting tables to help make ends meet. So what support and resources do we need to sustain our livelihoods? It's a difficult question to answer. And as Annalie said, we tend to wear many different hats, and we seek income outside of our chosen field and often even outside of our community. But I was thinking the other day, as a cultural worker, if I could have one resource right now, what would that be? I sort of like I was thinking, if I could dream, what would I have? And I didn't mention this earlier, but another significant difference I find between cultural development in cities and in rural and remote communities, although Annalie touched on it when she talked about the idea of the semantics and the language that we use in the cultural development world, the reality that the planners and decision makers within the municipality do not, at least in my experience, tend to appreciate the value of cultural development. This is a huge barrier for us as artists and cultural workers because we have to expend tremendous energy convincing people of the value of investing in culture. Mm-hmm. An argument that's now widely accepted in larger cities, the reality that creative cities not only attract tourists, but as we've talked about, significantly contribute to the quality of life of its residents. In fact, in cities and in cultural development theory, they've moved far beyond this economic benefit of culture and the arts argument, and they explore the myriad other ways in which cultural development supports our individual and community well-being. But in small towns, we still often find museum and art gallery volunteers sitting at council meetings, arguing their case to support their facilities or their initiatives or their organizations, having to defend their value, often a little bit sadly in relation to the value placed on and given the support given to sports-oriented groups and activities. So anyway, at our Arts Council board meetings, we have discussed many times the idea of preparing a public education strategy, advocating for the support of arts and culture. But it's just one of so many initiatives we're trying to undertake, and with our very limited resources, there's only so much time and energy we could give to that. I'm aware that there exists so much research and concrete data showing the economic benefits of culture by national organizations such as the Creative City Networks of Canada and by the international movement Agenda 21 for Culture. But it's a matter of having the time and energy to gather this information and present it in a manner which would be useful for the purposes of advocating for arts and culture in our small towns. I'm aware of quite a few public education strategies that are being used by organizations in small cities. Just south of us in North Bay, Creative Industries North Bay has been posting lovely videos on Facebook in which artists and cultural workers express what they feel is important to them about arts and creativity, to the quality of life and education and economics, and to their community identity. But it seems to me that if there were a single tool that we could all use, some kind of framework for advocacy that comprises both existing research and data about how that contributes to the value of a community, but also room to include images or videos or facts from an individual community, which could then together form a public education strategy unique to a particular place. I think that might be well received and appreciated by people like me working in these rural and remote communities with very limited resources. And it would be a huge step to reducing some of the strain that we face as artists and cultural workers, not only trying to do our work, but trying to convince others of the value of the work that we do. It's very tiring. And one other thing that we really, really need is opportunities to gather at conferences and workshops like we did at the Spark Symposium, that beautiful image there of us drumming there at the Spark Symposium in Cobalt last year. We had about 120 individuals from across Ontario, people supporting performing arts in rural and remote communities. We gathered to share knowledge and connect. We had young people leading workshops on how to engage youth. We had Francophone community members providing insights about collaborations and partnerships. We had funders, we had representatives from other networks so we could build on connections that have already been made. And these kind of gatherings are essential for cultural workers in small communities, not only for the practical purposes of meeting funders and finding out what money's out there, but it's vital for our spirits to meet like-minded people doing similar work and people who value the work that we do. So
excellent. A lot of great information in there, Felicity. And again, I think there is still some volume issues just on my end. And so to repeat the question so everyone knows what was asked of Felicity, it was what support and resources do artists and cultural workers need in rural and remote areas? We've got lots of great comments coming through, and there was one that jumped out at me. and this was, do you think that the Culture Days initiative is helping to increase awareness of the value of culture at the local leadership level? And I'll go back to Annalee really quickly. I don't know if you have any insights on that. Again, going back to making that case, is Culture Days doing good work in this area, or is there other things that are missing that could perhaps strengthen that work and move our advocacy forward in that regard?
Yeah, I think I hesitate to lump all rural and remote communities into one envelope in terms of the challenges.
Yep.
Because I think that is, if you talk about uniqueness, that is part of it, is that each
Definitely
community, especially in rural remote communities, have their own challenges. One may be dealing with, an incredible growth and not knowing how to handle that. Another one may be handling, newcomer issues coming into the community and not enough resources in the community. There's a lot of social sector issues in smaller communities, or they're they're just more visible because of the smaller population. So I think in terms of the challenges and the resources, they do have to be kind of tailor-made. From my experience living and working in different communities, I do think that the bent of cultural organizations advocating at council for the value of culture, I think we need to move beyond it. I think we need to actually ask the people and involve the community in the question in terms of community surveys and community interest and community power, because I do think that people do value culture in their communities, and they see it as a part of their everyday being in community. However, nobody's asking those quantitative questions and qualitative questions to the actual general public. And so that kind of community empowerment, community surveys I think would be a tool for cultural workers in rural remote communities to actually start to address those questions. And what are the questions to actually ask the broader community around culture? I mean, even defining the word, what does it mean in our community? Do you think on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you think cultural organizations, arts organizations add to our community well-being, and move away from the economic driver argument? And that's a preference that certainly the collective that I'm working in is moving towards a second generation planning lens. So I mean, there's all kinds of pieces around that, but basically it's moving beyond not so much that there isn't value and you give up one for the other, but I think some questions need to be asked of people's communities, of the members of the community. And then after that, I think the political will does come from the actual community.
Absolutely. And I guess speaking of community, we all know that we're in a time of change, whether urban or rural. There's population shifts, change in industry, the very character and what makes those rural and remote communities unique across the country are changing. So I'm just curious to hear any insights on that front in terms of the impact of changing economy and how to navigate those changes when cultural planning. And is it, again, the way we consult the public, the way we engage the public, the residents? I'll jump to Felicity quickly to see if she has any insights on that. And then Annalee, of course, if you have any follow-up to that. I'm just curious to get a sense of how we continue to do this type of cultural development work when the very environment around us is changing. So Felicity, over to you. Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure quite. Do you mean the environment in terms of the changing economy, and then the
economy? Sorry, Felicity. I meant the economy, or like the like local industry, what keeps people working and living in the city, how they make their living in the rural area.
I think that is probably a larger issue for rural and remote communities than for cities, because we're often we've been based, Cobalt is a mining community, and agricultural community, and that I think is the whole point of why it's equally important to be doing this cultural development work in our small towns, because for the exact reason those resources are no longer there. And yet we don't have that population, the critical mass to actually feel that creative vibe that you feel in cities. So then we turn to our, as Annalie was saying, our stories and our history, and it's all there. It's just more a matter of everyone, celebrating it and leveraging it, and not to use it to bring tourists, but to actually feel like, this is why this place feels so special. This we do. I think people know in small towns that we have this incredible quality of life, but maybe defining it is what we need to do. So yeah.
No, definitely. And Annalie, anything to add to that question?
Can you just repeat it for just
no worries at all. No worries at all. So I was commenting.
I'm thinking a million things right now. So
no, that's fantastic. Just making a comment about how rural and remote communities, their economies are changing, whether it's local industry, like so mining and cobalt, for example. And people live in rural and remote communities. They work there. When that starts to shift, how do we continue to do cultural development in the community where the economy is changing, and how can we best make use of a changing situation and still promote cultural advocacy in those communities when everything is shifting? New people are coming in or they're leaving, the economy is shifting. So any thoughts on that, Annalie?
Well, I think, like Felicity was saying, Canmore was a mining town, and it had a lot of people leaving after that, and obviously the industry. I mean, where I live now in Gananoque, it's was an industry town and as well, and tourism was the sort of saving grace in terms of the economy where I am right now, and in Canmore. It's not that much different. So what happens is that you have a certain strategy to bring people back or to bring people into your town when things are not thriving. And so that is done. And in some cases, when you do that, you don't have control over the growth that happens because of the tourism industry that you're bringing in to replace the industry. And people quite legitimately are worried about the divide between the local residents and the tourists or part-time residents that only come in the summer, or in some cases only come for the winter. So there is a real discussion to be had around that. And there are certain issues that culture can only address it if it sees itself as a contributor to community well-being as opposed to a advocate for the sector. So the shift in perspective, I think, has to be, what is our contribution to our community as cultural organizations, as cultural creators, as historians, as museums? What is our part in ensuring that our community identity is authentic and vital? And how does that then help the community as a whole? So there has to be but my suggestion, I guess, or where I'm coming from on that, is that the role of culture in a community and community building and community vitality, I don't know if that's been discussed as much as we could. And maybe after that, you get to see that, it's not a separate issue, especially in a smaller place. It's integral to the community identity, but it's sometimes seen as only for some people to participate in.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to stop really quickly, and I'm just trying to catch up with all the many chats and comments that are coming in, which are fantastic. And also going back to some of the responses that we received to Fanny's questions. Partnerships, collaborations, access to education resources to assist artists and cultural workers in rural and remote communities seems to be a hot topic. And so I do want to just put a shout out to all the attendees. We are all aware of many different resources that exist in our communities, whether it is webinars, other education tools, so this is a great opportunity to share those, and I see some of them being shared here. But again, I know we have representatives from ArtsBuild who are on here. I think Alex Glass has joined us. They have great webinars as well. And just looking at the attendee list, there is a wealth of great knowledge out there, and we really do want to capture those resources for those who are attending today. And so going back to, there was a point about like partnerships and collaborations. We talked briefly about regionalism, and we had a comment as well that talked about for very small rural communities, is the culture plan even worth it when there is no staffing or is no resources? So I guess my question is it better maybe to look at a more regional approach and maybe start there? Just throwing that out there, work at a more regional level, and build connections on that front, and then through that process have plans or strategies trickle down from that to assist those very small remote communities that may not have the resources, that are really struggling. Curious to hear any thoughts on that, and to our attendees, any resources or case studies that they may be aware of, and it could be Canadian, could be international as well, in terms of more regional cultural development work to assist smaller municipalities. And Felicity, I'll check in with you quick. I don't know if you're aware through your work with UBC, I know you did the cultural planning course there through your research. Were there any more regional opportunities or plans, or you did the sustainability plan as well with MDB Insights? Can you talk a little bit more about your work with that?
Yeah, again, like Annalie, I've got a lot I'm thinking about here.
Yes.
Yeah, there's so much. I'd be chatting away in that chat box if I could, but I think to your question about is it better to do a regional plan or to focus on, is it worthwhile doing a municipal cultural plan? There's just so many things in that alone. So the idea of doing a municipal cultural plan, and Annalie had alluded to this, the process is worthwhile because that is when you engage your community. That is when you talk about what is culture, what does it mean to you? And our experience here was that we had huge community engagement. People felt that, yes, culture is important to us. We believe we need these organizations, but not to be too negative. But again, we still have those council meetings where we still don't have a standard support, and we still, I was reading an article recently, I think I saw it on Facebook, not our town, another town, and it was volunteers exactly doing that, sitting in their municipal council meetings, still arguing. So it would be nice to move beyond that, but we still need the municipal support. The reality is we need that because they are making the decisions for us. So I'm babbling a bit here because there's so many things, but the idea of which is more important, the regional or municipal cultural plan, again, I think it depends on what's your purpose. The real purpose of cultural planning is not just to have a cultural plan, although there are benefits to doing that process, as I said, but it is to integrate culture into every aspect of municipal planning. That's the municipal planning process, is that you put a cultural lens on your transport system, on your education system. So that is a very different thing. Again, that is more about the quality of life of the individuals and the community well-being, which again, Annalie is saying that's really what it's about. So if you want to develop a tourism plan, that is part of cultural development, but that's the tourism plan. And the tourism plan probably in a small community does need to be developed with the region. And actually just this week, I've been emailing with our economic development officer about doing a tourism plan. And one of the, again, this is another issue again, but one of the difficulties that we have found with doing these plans is that the process was amazing and wonderful, and the community was involved, and we have these incredible, really good plans, but they are just sitting on the shelf. So they've had a negative impact in that the councillors now actually think they were a bit of a waste of time, because now you've got these plans sitting there. So anyway, I know I jumped around a lot there.
No, it's okay.
Like everybody, there's so much to think about and talk about here. So.
Excellent. And we have a very interesting comment, and I'll read it out. It's from Mark Sandiford. So Mark, thank you for sharing that. He says, interesting that artists from small places seem to have a greater expectation to participate in community building and community identity and delivering local value, rather than just making brilliant work as part of the global art making project. Do these artists need to move to bigger places if their interest is global rather than local? Just wondering. And so I can repeat that again. And Annalie, I'll go to you. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Do you want me to repeat it as well?
Sure.
Or yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was just interesting that artists from small places seem to have greater expectation to participate in community building and community identity to deliver a local value rather than just making brilliant work as part of the global art making project. So do they need to move to bigger places if their interest is global rather than local? Just wondering.
Yeah, well, there's an outreach and a reach in. So, I mean, what I have found in terms of working in smaller places always is that there is a greater expectation on artists to become part of the local community. And, you know, even from a tourism attraction perspective or from a donation perspective, or to help, you know, bolster the arts community. So there are those kind of key founder, if you want, organizations and key individuals in smaller places that everybody goes to look, you know, and that goes for organizations too, like, you know, folk festivals that have been around 40 years, etc. What is not really happening is there seems to be a gap between emerging and the people that have, you know, been very successful staying where they were in their small towns. I do think they don't need to. I think there has to be an understanding, though, that they don't necessarily have to move to larger communities, but they have to be clear on how much they can contribute to the local scene. And if they don't, they are somewhat considered not community minded, right? So it's a hard one. I have seen it happen quite a bit, actually.
Somewhat related to that point, I know some feedback that we got in terms of resources that could be of use are mentorships with larger, more established arts organizations. And Felicity, I'll jump to you just to see if, you know, perhaps you agree with that, or have you seen examples of that happening where you have rural, remote cultural workers and artists who have been able to either partner, mentor, or build a relationship with a larger, more established arts organization for mutual benefit?
I haven't actually seen it happen, but I know that there are some initiatives out there in order to, like, the Capicoa initiative with Arts Presenting, where you can partner with another organization, and Spark has been looking into mentorship opportunities. I think they're useful, but again, it's a matter of how much time and effort we can give to these things. When you say mentor, something that pops into my mind in terms of artists, it's always a balance, I think, in a small community, balancing providing mentors for our youth. And like having that outside influence. Do we always want to bring in artists from Toronto? It would be nice if we could just provide mentors, but there aren't a lot of performing artists in our community. So then we do have to bring in people from the outside. So I think mentorship is an important part of skills development, but it's a tricky topic for sure.
Definitely. And I'm going to jump in really quick here, just based on my past experience. I'm going back to my old Fringe Festival theater days. And one thing that I really enjoyed about the whole Fringe Festival movement was that it had a mix of your more urban, large city-centered festivals. But we had many smaller communities as well that took advantage of being part of a larger circuit. It was an opportunity to bring live performing arts to communities. And I know for other smaller communities, at least the past producers that I've talked with, they found it to be a very useful tool in terms of building that type of live performing arts community. So little plug here for the Fringe Festival movement. Any of us working in rural and remote communities who are looking at opportunities, Fringe Festival is a great one. So there you go. Yeah, and I have a question here. Oh, a comment. There are examples of artists in local communities who are a part of the social fabric and continue to create. Alice Munro served pies at the festival openings at the theater and continued to write her short stories. Alex Colville lived in Wolfville and continued his work while being part of Kings County. So thank you for sharing that, Peter Smith. Just again, an example of artists who continue to contribute to community while still practicing their arts. And I guess, Annalee, like going back to other resources that you feel that artists and cultural workers need based on your work, is there anything that, you know, we haven't missed or explored, or things that you feel would be of use to those artists and cultural workers? Well,
I think cultural workers are quite a different, like, artists are different than cultural workers in that way. So I do think that there are some networks, and you're doing it now, and Creative Cities Network and so on, for municipal cultural workers in remote communities. But arts organizations and arts councils also have kind of a network. But I think in terms of resources, it's some of it is around empowering yourselves and your organization, because a lot of times organizations or smaller communities think they have to have a cultural consultant come in to do a plan. And I do think that there are ways in which, I mean, time is obviously the factor, mainly because most organizations are reacting in reactive mode, not planning mode. So there is just not enough people to do the actual work anyway. So that is an issue. However, I do think that a local engagement team, or a local team, can do their own cultural planning, and don't always need to have paid consultants. But I mean, if they had support, yes. But if they don't, maybe some tools around what are the steps in cultural planning, and I know there is toolkits out there to do that, but specifically for smaller communities in terms of how to do a survey, and what are the questions, how to, there are a lot of social media tools and SurveyMonkey and things like that now that'll do the analysis for you. So I'm wondering if there's just some pieces of cultural plan development that can be simplified and not too onerous to start with, that maybe include advocacy to politicians, etc., or steps, but kind of a step-by-step or packaging that people can pull what they need out of it and adjust it and make it flexible enough that it works for the uniqueness of a community. That is, like, how are you going, the state of readiness, for instance, in terms of a cultural plan? Do you have this in place? Do you have like a checklist? Or, are you a population of such? Do you have a municipal worker on staff? Are you all volunteer? Like, and then going from there, so that you're kind of setting people up to answer the uniqueness of their communities, and it's not a one-size-fits-all toolkit, but more some pieces that would work individually for people that they can pluck out. And
no, absolutely. And I think in terms of that one-size-fits-all, we had another comment as well in terms of establishing best practices for cultural development, recognizing that what works in big cities, we tend to go and refer to those communities as the benchmark, and again, it makes it that much more important for people who are working in these rural and remote areas to share what research they do have, so that we can start benchmarking based on that rural and remote framework. Because I think there is a lot of just reliance on, Edmonton is doing this, or Calgary is doing this.
Absolutely.
And not to say it's bad work, but it's just different. Those best practices aren't necessarily the best practice for those smaller communities. So
politicians react to, there used to be a per capita, right?
Yes.
Like, $5, $10 per capita per cities, but they were the larger cities. And so, is $3 per capita, is that a good rate for a small community? There's not very many comparators, and Hill and Associates, they Heritage Canada and Stats Canada and stuff, they don't do that stuff. So there is some work to be done, maybe through the cultural, I forget what it's called actually, the cultural, not the monitor, but the statistician.
Arts Hill Monitor?
Or no, I know, not the research monitor. I know Kelly does that work.
Yes.
It's Stats Canada. It's a cultural statistics group.
Satellite, the cultural satellite, the creative industry.
That's it.
Hang on. Thanks, Felicity. Yep.
Yeah. So because people want facts and they want evidence to show that their community is doing, just as well as someone else. And if you have zero investment versus $3 per capita, there's a range there. But the information is very difficult to get at in terms of comparators for small rural communities.
Absolutely. I was assisting MDB Insights as well on their culture plan for the town of Bradford, West Gwillimbury, and it was quite the challenge to find comparative municipalities. Yes. And in that case, though, we had an incredible contact at the city who understood that, and you try to do the environmental scan and provide what you can. So again, going back to the role of mass culture, for all of us on the front line doing that groundwork, what type of data do we need where can we find it, and sharing that so we can make the best use of our time, for sure. So
yeah, that's critical.
Definitely. And Felicity, anything to add to that as well in terms of like those comments, or?
No, I think that I was sort of nodding along there. Yeah.
No worries at all. And I'm just checking to see if we have any other questions here. Okay, this is from Kathy Shopateki. Apologies if I mispronounced your last name, Kathy. She says, I'm super interested in the connection to land context in rural and remote places. Instinct tells me that culture practices might be more attached to land here in those rural and remote regions, but maybe she's off base. In Ottawa, actually more than 80% rural, we're on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe land. Learning from Indigenous knowledge keepers and cultural practitioners is an interest of mine as well. Any notes or resources or comments from other places are appreciated. So I think going just back to that idea about the connection to land, and any closing thoughts on that. I recognize that we're coming up on the 5-minute mark. So I just curious to hear any thoughts on that in terms of cultural development in rural and remote regions being more connected to land and place, I guess, as opposed to in a more larger setting where there's many other different factors. Annalie, any closing thoughts on that?
Well, obviously for the Indigenous cultures, land is a key. You know, to use the example of Canmore, it's around mountain culture. So we've spent quite a bit of time actually asking the question of what is mountain culture, and what does that mean? It's been an interesting exploration of talking about land. We hope to use it as sort of a frame for the plan, and what does that mean? Because it's something that all people can, you know, have an attachment to. So yeah, I do think, Kathy, that it is quite prevalent. We looked, when we started to, just as an example, when we started to look at that in Canmore and defining mountain culture, a lot of it was around the newness of every day. A lot of it had parallels to the actual practice of the creative work that people do in terms of pushing the boundaries, the discipline regarded for that. So there's some interesting changes there. But from the Indigenous perspective, we're hoping to actually get more of that discussed in order to have that larger conversation, to have it act as almost as a starting point for the dialogue, because it is something that all people there relate to. And I think you're right, in cities they do not. I mean, you know, where I live, it's the water and the river. So there is this thing that makes people come together around that, that people take it not for granted, but that people don't take it for granted and are much more aware of the land and all the elements that it entails. And what does that do to a community, and how does that impact a community in the way in which they live and the way in which they work. So, and the dependency on each other is higher. So I do think that there is a deep sense of pride and ownership of the land without overstepping it. So there is a discussion right now around using the land and being one with the land. So yeah, I don't have an answer. I know I'm just babbling on, but there is some work being done around that at an international level, which I can probably put in the Dropbox or.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll make sure to share it on the Knowledge Center, Annalie. And then Felicity, just over to you, just some closing thoughts. And again, the connection to land, or any other thoughts that you have on the subject.
Well, I mean, just in terms of land, I mean, that's why I live here. It's beautiful. I can go for a walk. I'm very connected to the land, and I feel very grateful for that. So I'm also conscious of the time. So I'll leave it at that.
Worries, yeah.
I think that's a huge part of living in rural and remote communities, is feeling that connection.
Absolutely. And again, a shout out to everyone who is attending to share their own experiences, again, connection to the land, what have you. And I'm getting a question that says that part of Kathy's question that particularly stood out was, quote, learning from Indigenous knowledge keepers and cultural practitioners, and how to go about that respectful and with relevance to the folks you are learning from. So I think just a thought to share with everyone as we continue this work in cultural development in rural and remote regions. And I'm just going to, I thought I got through all of the slides here. I just wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to see the great shots. And on that front, with about a minute to spare, I just wanted to wrap things up and thank everyone for attending, and in particular, Annalee, Felicity, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise and insights. Just a wealth of knowledge there. And again, to encourage everyone attending to continue to share on the Knowledge Center. And I am getting a note here, the link for the Knowledge Center has been shared in the comments, so do feel free to go to that site and share your knowledge there. I'm also being told that a survey will be sent around to all the attendees. A link will be shared, and we do love the feedback. Again, this is an experiment, a pilot, if you will, this whole digital gathering framework, and your ideas, your feedback play a huge role in helping us to share future conversations. So again, thank you so much to everyone, and to all of the practitioners working on the front lines. I said this in the last digital gathering, and I'll share it again with everyone here. We don't necessarily hear thank you enough, and so I wanted to thank you for all the important work that you are doing in your own communities. Volunteerism is huge. I know a lot of you are doing it unpaid and for the sheer passion of it, and so thank you for that. And you do share what you're doing with us. We would love to hear about it. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day. And we will
Thank you, Mass Culture. It's great.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.